we can carry on talking, it doesn't actually matter. Whoever's got the thing, can you just make sure that's going around so everyone signs it, including our speakers, if you could just sign that you're here. One. It's the bit where I have to update the blog, even though it's already started. We will be starting a few minutes late, so talk amongst yourselves. Okay. Welcome everyone to the IHR Digital History Seminar and our postgraduate panel. We haven't done a postgraduate panel before at the Digital History Seminar, but we did it for kind of two reasons. One, because We've been wanting for a while to showcase some of the work that postgraduate students do, and sometimes a 45-minute paper might seem a bit too long. And also because some people in postgraduate roles were saying to us, well, I've kind of got things I want to test or problems that I have, I'm kind of looking at Jack here slightly, that I want to talk to people about as part of my research. I want to do that in part of a sort of slightly different seminar environment. So we've got 5 speakers today from 4 different institutions speaking across topics which cover about 400 or 500 years of European and international history, which is not bad. And as I was saying to the speakers earlier on, one of the things I'm really delighted about is that we have a range of not just time periods, but kind of different types of source materials that people are working with, which I think is a really important thing to reflect in the way in which scholars at the beginning of their research careers are starting to think about using computers as part of their research. And we always say in this seminar that it's not entirely about the digital, it is about the history. So we're trying to showcase here people who are doing stuff to kind of get at historical questions, historical problems through using computers as historians. So I'm delighted to welcome our speakers. Each of our speakers will speak for about 10 minutes. They're already running late, which is a good start. And what I'm going to suggest is we keep our questions to the end and try, if we can, to think of questions that cut across at least kind of 2 of our speakers on each occasion. I won't demand that as chair, but I will hope we can come up with questions on that ilk. I will be waving at people when they are close to time, and I will do something along 2 minutes when you have 2 minutes left. Okay. So we're starting today with Roisin Astell, who is a Chase-funded PhD student at Kent. I have a Chase-funded PhD student at the moment, so I love Chase funding. Who is a medievalist who will be talking today about English Gothic illuminators. And your slides are already up there. Do you want to do it and then go?
Is it okay if I sit down?
Yeah.
I will.
And if we get too hot, open the window.
Perfect. So my doctoral research focuses on a unique image text paradigm in the design of decorative initials in English and French illuminated manuscripts from about 1270 to 1320. And here, as you can see in some of the images on the PowerPoint, illuminated faces are shown in the act of looking alongside text, overtly emphasizing the importance and power of human sight. So this type of head initial was around, but it seems to have seen popularity in French manuscripts from about 1270 and appears to have rapidly gained popularity in England. And so despite the prevalence of this image type, these decorative devices have been largely overlooked in scholarship. And so this is what I'm trying to do with my research. So to conduct my research, I'm focusing on the design of head initials in a number of case studies with the aim of tracing and charting the dissemination of this inventive image type and figuring out what is actually going on. So a big part of my research is trying to identify the different artists that worked on manuscripts. And as will be shown, the number of artists working on a manuscript can vary. It could be one single artist who completed all the images within the manuscript to a number of people working on different imagery in the book. And often when manuscripts have appeared to be illuminated by the same group of people, this is given the collective term workshop. So the term workshop often proposes that the artists work together as a unified group. And here are just a few examples of the different groups we have. We've got French groups, workshop in French is being atelier here. And then we've got a list of examples of English groups. And these are just a few, there are so many more. And the term workshop, group, or atelier here has its advantages. It enables art historians to better understand which manuscripts potentially relate to one another, whether that be in style or through the different artistic hands working on them. However, as I've been finding in my research, this term can be pretty problematic. As Professor Michael has highlighted, scholarship on illuminated manuscripts have moved from single monographic studies to, quote, broader accounts that maintain the dominance of a single lavish manuscript around which lesser books are grouped, end quote. So the idea that a group centers around one manuscript with lesser manuscripts around it is incredibly problematic. This presumes that one manuscript is potentially better, more superior than the others. And also using this central group methodology, this has enabled scholars to use their central manuscript and to kind of exert their findings on the other ones around it. So what do we do with all of this? Well, there are a number of ways in which art historians have and continue to attempt to understand the different relationships between artists and manuscripts. We've got this first lineal model, which is pretty basic, as shown by an example from Professor Michael's article. And this attempts to demonstrate the transformations in styles as seen from one manuscript to another. We have another model here, again, the same kind of linear pattern, which includes what Professor Michael labels as a constant of place. So this is either a single location where the manuscripts were produced or where the artists were trained alongside the time at the bottom. But this has a lot of issues in itself. It does not offer evidence of movement of the artists moving from one place to another, and it doesn't give us evidence of collaboration between artists. And also another issue with this diagram or this kind of modelling is that the constant of place is troublesome, for it produces a static quality to medieval artists. The more conceivable reality of medieval illuminators is that whilst they trained in a centre, such as London, Oxford or Cambridge, they were travelling from city to city, working on lots of different manuscripts. And it is this understanding of the transitory nature of illuminators which provides us an understanding of how different artistic styles can be found in one manuscript and in another, and how these styles were disseminated and transmitted across a variety of illuminated manuscripts. So what's more useful for us is to try and do some kind of networking diagram, which enables us to see the collaboration and influence from other artists within one manuscript. So having given a pretty brief overview of workshops and different issues we have with figuring out who painted these manuscripts, how does this fit into my research and presentation today? Well, as mentioned, my research is structured around a number of case studies. In each chapter, I'm predominantly focusing on one manuscript, but as I'm trying to chart the dissemination of this image type, I'm also devoting part of the chapter to investigating the relationship of this artist in these manuscripts to other manuscripts, and how the respective manuscripts belonged to other groups and whether the artistic hands involved demonstrate the transmission of iconography. So one of the central manuscripts I'm looking at is the Wells Apocalypse at the British Library. This manuscript is huge, it's really big, it's probably like about that, I don't know if I'm doing it like that big, and it's really heavy. I don't know if the photo gives it any justice. This manuscript was believed to have been produced in England around 1310, and it is illuminated by one artist throughout the whole manuscript and one scribe as well. So the artist, which I have inventively named the Wells Apocalypse artist, has a particular style and execution to his or her work, which makes it easier for me trying to figure out where they are featured in other manuscripts. And so this manuscript, Wells Apocalypse, was first included within a group called the Tickle Psalter group. And this was by Donald Drew Egbert in 1940. And for him, he placed the Tickle Psalter, which is in the New York Public Library, as his central manuscript. However, by placing the Wells Apocalypse within this group, this creates the illusion that all the manuscripts listed here were all connected to one another, which really is not the case. So what we do know is that the Wells Apocalypse artist can be found in 4 manuscripts of this really long list by Egbert. He or she seems to have illuminated all but 2 of the illuminations in the Pabham Clifford Hours, half of the Tickle Psalter main illuminations and initials, and only one single illumination in the Bobard Psalter in Lambeth Palace Library. And since Egbert's work in 1940, Professor Lucy Freeman-Sandler has disputed this original list, quite rightly, removing 3 of the manuscripts completely, but then she actually adds a few more manuscripts into the list. And since then, other scholars have tried moving these groups around, adding and removing other manuscripts. So where does this lead us to? Well, as I hope I've tried to demonstrate in the 10 minutes, which is not enough time for this topic, but I hope I've kind of suggested to you that just listing these manuscripts in groups together, like the ones we saw before, is not ideal and it's really not very helpful. And attempting to do a family tree is a bit of a struggle. So to maneuver my way through this labyrinth, I am attempting to use network analysis to create a better way of visually negotiating the different artistic hands working on manuscripts and how they may be related. And before I go on, I'd just like to add that I'm indebted to the inspiration and advice I've received from Doctors Aleks Kaye and Maeve Doyle on their ongoing project, Illuminating Networks in French Gothic Manuscripts. Ciao. So, disclaimer, this is a work in progress, and here it is. So this is one group that I'm trying to figure out. We have the nodes here, which are the circles, and they represent the different artistic hands and the different manuscripts. And the edges, which are the lines, represent the connections between the identified artists at work and respective manuscripts. And what's even great about using this kind of methodology is that we can distinguish the hands from the manuscripts and by changing the color. So for example, we've got the pink nodes, which are individual artists, and the turquoise nodes, which are ones with head initials that I am investigating. And here's just an example of another case study I'm doing and how it all links together. And so I hope that using network analysis will enable me to identify not only which manuscripts have this image type, but whether there is a link between the artists and the manuscripts, and whether this can elucidate understanding on the popularity and dissemination of this image type, as well as taking the agency away from the elusive workshop and placing it onto the artists themselves. Thank you.
In time and everything.
5 seconds is fair.
Yeah. Leah. So Leah's NWO funded. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Do you know the?
Yeah, I know the NWO. Yeah. As a PhD student at Maastricht University, working on 19th-century microscopy. I knew I wasn't going to say that out loud properly. I can't say the word anymore. Microscopy. There you go. I think I wrote it down wrong, and what was in my head was coming wrong. Anyway, microscopy. I'm just not doing it now. You're on the top there.
Oh, no.
You're one of the other ones.
Same title.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah, that's it.
And Leah will be talking today about crowdsourcing and some of microscopy. Fun.
Yeah, thank you, James. My PhD project deals with 19th century microscopy, and as part of that project, I run a citizen science project. It was launched in April this year, so it's still quite fresh. I don't have any fancy visualizations yet. It's very much work in progress still. But yeah, I'm going to just briefly introduce you to this citizen science project. It's called Words of Wonder. It's hosted by the Zooniverse, which is, I think, one of the biggest citizen science platforms, web-based citizen science platforms. Just a few words about the reasoning behind this project. In the mid-19th century, which I'm focusing on, there was an increase in scientific illustrations, in illustrated scientific works due to cheaper printing techniques and increased literacy rates, among other things. And illustrations, as we've just heard, were often the result of collaboration, really, among printers, illustrators, scientists, engravers, editors. And I'm really interested in these collaborations across disciplines, across countries even. And also, what I like about looking at illustrations is that they were often produced by people who were rather in the margins of the scientific community, by women, trained illustrators rather than scientists. And what I find particularly interesting about the 19th century is that there were more and more scientific illustrations, but copyright laws were not really internationally enforced yet. So what you see is that illustrations were copied a lot and reproduced, and then also changed to adapt them to different audiences, to target different audiences with them. And I'm interested in how they traveled and how they were involved in building scientific communities, really, because people, they use illustrations, microscopists use illustrations to communicate their observations, and they were quite good at adapting them to the people they wanted to reach. And I'm interested in how they did that and how communities formed around these traveling illustrations, basically. So the research questions underlying my project and this citizen science project specifically are who were these illustrators, who could contribute illustrations to 19th century scientific publications, in my case, microscopy publications, how many images were illustrations of specimens, how many were maybe construction manuals that even enabled people to build instruments themselves, is something I find interesting. Did that stop at some point? Did publications stop printing construction manuals? Did the number of illustrations change over time? Did it vary across countries? I'm focusing on British, American, and Germany microscopy, because these were more or less the centers of microscopy at the time, where the leading microscope manufacturers produced their instruments and where microscopy societies emerged. And then I'm also interested in illustrations that were copied, whose illustrations were copied, where did they travel, and did the reproductions also raise issues of scientific authority, of authenticity. And I think the reason I got this project funded by the NVO is that I also asked if this teaches us anything about present-day science communication on online platforms, because there's some parallel, if you want, between these images being reproduced and images going viral today. Is that kind of reasoning kind of happened. So it's just a screenshot of the project. As I said, it's hosted by the Zooniverse citizen science platform, and I use publications digitized by the Biodiversity Heritage Library. They were happy to provide their publications. And I invite citizen scientists to classify scientific illustrations, microscopy illustrations. They're asked to identify illustrators. They're asked to tell me what they see in these illustrations. And also, they are asked to flag reproductions of microscopy of microscopy illustrations. If they find out that they are reproductions, it's often not easy to tell, but sometimes the surrounding text says that the illustration was reproduced from somewhere else, or that or they may see illustrations popping up in different periodicals or books. So I also asked them to do that, so I can really trace these reproductions. I should probably say that this project was also inspired by the Science Gothic project, in case anyone knows that, by the Constructing Scientific Communities research group. I interned with them 3 years ago. So there are some similarities that I'm very much indebted to their work also. This is just an example of, this is the workflow of the project. So people are asked, are there any illustrations on the page that they are shown? Asked to choose the type of illustration, and mark any handwritten captions and contributors, so I can get transcriptions of the illustrators, printers, and then search them. And also to add keywords to describe the illustrations, so I can also search illustrations for certain specimens, for example, or instruments, manufacturers. And then ultimately I get this CSV file that I can download and search, and hopefully produce visualizations from that. I haven't really started to do that. A very important part of the citizen science project is the talk forum. I didn't really expect that, but we do have this forum as part of the project where people can exchange observations, where they can flag any problems they have. It's really nice to see that some people get very enthusiastic about researching microscopy. Here you can see that someone really she tried to find out where these photographs came from. It was mentioned in the text that they were reproduced from somewhere, and then she went and had a look at other publications online, other libraries. And And then in the end, she said, this rabbit hole is getting deeper by the minute, climbing out now while I still can. So it's really nice to see how much people like 19th century microscopy. It's very niche, but so it's really nice to have this community of researchers really in this forum, and people that point me into different directions also sometimes. Yeah, so just some very, very preliminary results in Outlook. As I said, I've been running this for a couple of months only, but so far the illustrations have triggered searches for information about unpublished illustrators. So people are really interested in who made these illustrations, and the full text search of the BHL and Internet Archive has been really, really helpful. I think it was only introduced a few years ago, but it's so easy now to piece together biographical information about people you don't really know, or of whom not much information is left. But you can, for example, you can search for names in society reports and then see people are mentioned in these reports, and then kind of piece together their biographies. And then, yeah, random fact is that American publications seem to contain more illustrations of agricultural microscopy for some reason. This is the reason I went to the Department of Agriculture in the US. So this has really also kind of changed the course of my research slightly. Many illustrations were copied from German publications. So I also uploaded German publications in addition to British and American publications. I quite like that citizen scientists are interested in female illustrators, so they made their own little collections of female illustrators. And overall, yeah, crowdsourcing citizen science has been really rewarding, but also very time-consuming. It's something I didn't expect. I think many people don't really expect that, and the idea is often that you have people work for you, and this is not something you really have to devote much time to, but I do. I mean, you also have to keep this project running. You have to be very present in social media. But I would do it all again, definitely. I think I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Fabulous. And within time. We're doing very well. Aleks. So Aleks is a PhD student at UCL, working on 19th century migration, and we'll be talking today about, do you want to hand sort this out? Talking today about social networks of Polish migrants in South America. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
I thought that was right.
Is this one right? No.
Maybe that one. There you go.
Can I have it? Oh, I see.
Oh, he's doing that thing. Okay, yeah, whenever you're ready.
Yep, I'm ready. Hi everyone, so yep, I'm Aleks, and the work that I'm going to talk to you today about is based on my PhD research, which examines the role that migrants play in production and transnational circulation of scientific knowledge, and it will be based on the example of Polish migrants to Latin America between 1830 and 1890. I'm very interested in how knowledge travels and how scientific ideas move, evolve, and get adapted to different contexts. And so in my transnational research, I traced the involvement of Polish emigrants to Latin America in the production and circulation of scientific ideas. And because I have a background in both history and sociology, I believe that historical research can benefit from employment of sociological research methods to questions asked by historians. And I have also been increasingly interested in applying kind of technological solutions to historical research. So thank you very much for letting me speak here and be involved in this seminar series. So quite early on in my research, I decided to create a database, first in Excel, but later I migrated it to Access to help me keep track of the information that I found about the individual Polish migrants to Latin America. So on this slide, you can see what my database looks like. So I thought not only would this database help me to organize keep organized, but I also thought it would help me to later use technology to analyze the data that I collected. So currently, my database has information about 158 Polish migrants to Latin America, and I record various information about them, such as their names, educational backgrounds, their occupations, what they did, like which year they migrated to Latin America, and what year they left, if they left, because quite a lot of the Polish migrants remained in Latin America. So thanks to this database, I can now produce graphs and maps and social network visualizations and run various queries related to the educational, professional, and social backgrounds of the migrants. So what I'm currently exploring in my research and what I wanted to talk to you about today is the feasibility of using networks as both a metaphor and an analytical tool in historical research. So I think networks can help us to question conventional assumptions about how knowledge travels, and can be also used to highlight and challenge the problematic center-periphery model, which views people from peripheral nations. So in my case, the partitioned Polish territories and also the newly independent Latin American republics, as dependent on centers for progress and knowledge. Like I feel that that's not very accurate, as after all, the so-called peripheral nations collaborate now and have done so for many centuries. So yeah, so I think that the application of the social network theory to historical contexts can help historians to gain a better understanding of how individuals facilitated the exchange of knowledge, and it also gives us a tool to reinforce our ideas and our arguments. And so, so I believe that combining these formalized social networks methods, such as social network analysis, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, and which you talked about as well, with more kind of traditional historical research methods, such as qualitative analysis of primary sources, can work really well. So within the broad scope of social network analysis, there are various different discussions on how actors within the network interact with one another and contribute towards spread of ideas and behaviors. And the two ideas that I'm currently considering applying to my research are the mechanisms of brokerage proposed by Ronald Burt in 1992, and the idea of closure put forward by James Coleman in 1988. So on to the next slide. So this is just an illustration that I found online, which I think would be helpful to what I'm about to talk about. So Coleman's idea of closure is linked to the ideas of intangible social capital, which exists in relations between people. And in my case, knowledge can count as an example of this social capital. And for people to benefit from said social capital existent within their network, Coleman argues that there's two conditions that are necessary. So firstly, strong and close social ties. So for example, ties that exist within families or close communities, or religious ties, for example. Between people in groups or clusters, as they are called in kind of the network terminology. And secondly, the clustering needs to be in a closure configuration. And to achieve closure configuration, Coleman argues, trustworthiness and obligation and loyalty is necessary among all the members of that cluster. And for Burt, similarly as to Coleman, social clusters are groups of people within a social network who know each other and share certain explicit and implicit understanding. And Bert then further introduces the idea of brokerage, in which he builds on Coleman's closure and explains that an individual's role in knowledge transfer in a network is that they can either specialize within the cluster, therefore facilitating the closure we talked about, or build bridges between the metaphorical kind of buffer zones between people in different clusters. So in other words, they can participate in brokerage of knowledge between groups. And it is, according to Bert, those people that build the bridges that are really crucial for the spread of new ideas and behaviors. So the configuration of the connections between people can be very complex, and so social network analyses are often accompanied by various visualizations of the networks, which can help to kind of clarify the complexity of the connections that are being studied. So I would now like to show you some of the visualizations that I made, and thanks to various primary sources, such as photographs like this one, or letters of the migrants, notebooks, travel diaries, and so on, I was able to attempt to map this social network of Ernest Malinowski. So in the previous photo, he's the man here sitting in the middle. Just as a brief kind of introduction, Malinowski was a Polish engineer who migrated to Peru in 1857, and then he was involved in the construction of the rail line that goes across the Andes, and that rail line until 2006 was one of the highest in the world. So this is the ego network that I've made of his work, and it's basically just showing the cluster of people that Malinowski knew personally. And you would probably agree that this network kind of looks nice and neat and tidy, which leads me to an issue that I identified, which is that an image of a network can create the impression that the connections being studied between people were more structured or, concrete, complete than they were in reality. So in reality, sometimes these connections were fleeting and hard to pinpoint, and they can change dramatically over time. And so it's hard to visualize them properly in a static situation like this. So I think, the way to move forward is to maybe look into dynamic time varying networks. And this is something that shows how networks change over time. There's programs such as Graph Visual Rhythm that use that, but I'm just starting to look at that. So that's very much kind of ideas in progress. And then further, this is a network that I expanded to show how Ernest Malinowski's ego network would connect to somebody else's network. So you probably heard of Alexander von Humboldt. He would have had a cluster of people around him, and here we can see that Józef Waszewicz would have been the man connecting this cluster with Humboldt's cluster. So this ego network that I showed you today of Ernest Malinowski, is only really a tiny part of a much larger social intellectual network, and I hope that as my research progresses, I will be able to expand it and show the connections of Polish people across all of Latin America, and also people left in the partitioned Polish territories, perhaps even globally. So thank you very much for listening to me today.
Thank you. Jack. I was going to say Jack is at the University of Kent, but that's not true, is it?
I'm kind of still there.
You're still kind of at the University of Kent. And were you Chase funded? And I didn't know that one either, actually.
Yes.
You were Chase, there you go. Jack is kind of at the University of Kent.
Yeah.
And was Chase funded. And we'll talk today a bit about medieval legal records, but also failing.
Yes. Mostly about failing. It's okay.
Yeah, you can do it. Yeah.
I'm comfortable sitting down. Yeah. So I'll just talk briefly about my thesis, but I'll mostly talk about my methodology and kind of, how it failed. So I explore a series of investigations of allegedly corrupt officials across the first half of the 14th century. These investigated complaints against officials, especially in the 1320s and 1340s. And I look at about 50 individual trials, and they haven't really been considered for as a whole. And then it works across 4 chapters on the slide. So this is what one of the trials looks like. It's really rich material. It's really interesting kind of biographical detail and evidence of material life of individuals, but also kind of illuminates things that we don't know because, for example, we know how the tax was collected. Well, we can work out how the tax was collected by looking at complaints about the tax collectors because there's no one document that kind of outlines how that process was carried out. So immediately I kind of set out to create a series of data sets, and I had the idea that this would be useful to people in my field, but also people outside my immediate field. So, people were interested in the material lives of individuals across a 50-year period, or people who study governance from a social science perspective. I kind of also had the idea that I would share it with people who have a data science background, and they might kind of take approaches that I hadn't considered. But as you'll see, that's not happened. So I had some Latin and paleography background, but at first, kind of just simply reading this stuff was a challenge, as you might be able to see. They're heavily abbreviated, inconsistent, and they're produced by a myriad series of legal processes. So there's law books from the period that outline a number of different writs that were in circulation, and there's over 800. So it took me a while before I could read them, and once I could, with some consistency, the challenge became kind of just unpicking regional variations or just mistakes. So there's some debate about how much the clerks actually even knew Latin, and whether they were just using stock phrases and bolting them together. The vocabulary was also a real challenge, and I was sitting there with 5 or 6 dictionaries with different focuses, and kind of reconstructing these changes over time. It was painful. But despite this, I thought it was a good idea to set out on a data set. Initially, I recorded a lot of extraneous information. So the first data set contains over 500 allegations and 17 variables, so place names, sums of money, material evidence. It was a bit silly, really. And some of them, the allegations take more than just straight translation. So I had to decimalize the sums of money involved just before I could do any calculations. Place names had to be referenced with modern equivalents, and person names had to be standardized. All of these factors meant that creating a data set was really time consuming. But as I progressed and my focus narrowed, I kind of started to record less and less variables, and today I really only record those that are directly relevant. So kind of, I think, drawing conclusions from the data in the way that I tried to do was problematic. So this is one charge on the slide, and it was kind of, this is representative of a frequent way of recording information. So this is just about a sheriff who basically was not releasing people who should be released unless they paid a bribe, and was releasing people who shouldn't be released if they paid a bribe. So it's hard to kind of record this in a database really, in the way I was planning on. Is it a single charge? It's a suspiciously round sum, which it often is. How do I categorize this? Also, a lot of individuals often just paid a fine, and it just says for diverse transgressions. And so what do I do with that? I just ignored it mostly. So it kind of made me question the value of like a rigid data-driven approach. I have around, at the moment, a data set of about 2,000 allegations across several different regions. But I really, for reasons I've outlined, thought it was problematic. For each trial was comprised of different officials who were running it, and they each took a different approach. And even within the same trial, different clerks had different approaches in how they were recorded. And what the trial was kind of set out, the investigation set out to do, was defined by the immediate national but also local context. But all that said, it was useful in some ways. So firstly, it really got me familiar with the sources. I really, recording 2,000 allegations, I really knew what was there and what wasn't there. It also kind of allowed me to shape the focus of where I was going to put most of my effort in the first slide with the chapters. And I could use the data to show in general terms the number of allegations which changed over a 20-year period. So this shows tax offences roughly over a 30-year period, because obviously the retrospectives, the charges here date back to 1310, something like that. And I talked about fines. So what you'll see is obviously these two are quite high figures for a number of allegations. In Worcestershire and Herefordshire, every single tax collector was fined. And so you see, while these are looking at much more offences, the overall number is still relatively low. But Worcestershire and Herefordshire had just rebelled against the king. So it's not necessarily reflective, unless you really drill into the local context, to just go off the raw data. But I could also construct another network here. It's quite a crude approach, but these are wall collectors who are co-offending. So when they're mentioned in the same charge, they come up together. So the size of the point indicates the number of offences committed, and the strength of the line indicates how often they were connected to a particular individual. This was useful because it kind of let me know, when I simplified by the weight, which individuals to look at most closely for my process of graphical analysis. And these 4 individuals connect to 2 or maybe 3 networks that are of significant national importance. And so kind of the data let me jump down that level where these guys aren't particularly prominent until you look at them in this way. I tried some mapping. I'm not sure how useful this was. On the left, there's the extent of historic marshland, estimated extent of historic marshland, and on the right is a number of offences committed by wall collectors. I realised when I was looking at this in a kind of large scale, it just was kind of really reflective of population centres. And so when you overlay it to, and this is quite crude because I'm not very good at Photoshop, but so this is the marshland, and you see it actually corresponds quite closely. So all I was really looking at is where people live, rather than actually where was corruption taking place. But I think by looking at kind of the two, the network and the mapping in conjunction, when I get down to more of the micro level, it might be useful. So while I suggest that this is like a failure, obviously a lot of it was successful. But I think the failure I look at is much to do with my lack of background skills in these areas, the digital skills. I have to learn a lot of that along the way, rather than the validity of the methods themselves. But also particularly in my expectations of what a data set could do for me. I think I had these grand ideas when I set out, which were rather overly ambitious. But really, actually, if I look at it as a process rather than an output, then it becomes much more valuable in terms of getting to know the sources much more closely. And I kind of still have the hope to use this for a wider audience, but the data definitely requires a lot more work. And I think a lot of the failure rests in the fact that I just kind of jumped into it immediately without really knowing what I was doing. I didn't really know the limits of my thesis even at that point. Also, I think it was so difficult to kind of learn these skills, plus the Latin, plus the paleography, as well as doing just a normal thesis that has to be finished within more than 3 years now. So, but in the future, so over the last year, I've kind of been learning R for statistical analysis, and I managed to get a place at the Oxford Digital Humanities Summer School. such a mouthful. I did a course on linked open data. So I'm kind of looking over the next year to develop an ontology of corruption using my data that I've collected so far. And I want to see if it's possible to use that to then text mine local record society volumes, because there's quite a few trials in the 14th century, and develop a linked open data set. It's not.
And finally, we have Lea, who is based at Oxford and will be speaking today about the Voltaire Library Project.
I'm just going to make sure. Great. So thank you first to James and to the seminar for this opportunity to share my research and Hello World on YouTube. So the premise of my project, which I've been working on since about the second year of my undergraduate career, is to uncover what Voltaire read and then to link it and see how it shaped his work. And what makes this library really special, it has 6,763 books, a third of which are annotated. And it's a working library as opposed to a collector's library, meaning that Voltaire actively engaged with these texts and then he used them in the work that we continue reading to this day. So when it comes to investigating the library, our story actually begins in Russia, as any good story does begin, with Catherine the Great, who purchased the library as a monument to the Enlightenment and had it brought to St. Petersburg. Now, about 200 years later, a catalog is produced in around 1961, and it's a fabulous resource. It gives us the author, title, and date and place of publication, but it's also massive, as you can see, 1,166 pages long, and parts of it are in Russian. And the reason I ended up working on this is because Russian is my first language. So I had that skill, but the point is this is not an accessible text to most people working in the early modern period. So the question becomes, how can we transform this into a resource that would be useful for reconstructing Voltaire's working laboratory of thought, as it's been called before? So the basic process with which most of us are familiar is optical character recognition. So making this machine readable and then transforming it into a spreadsheet that I've lovingly called the spreadsheet of doom. All of us will be familiar with the feeling of the spreadsheet of doom. And of course, once you transform it into this malleable resource, you can start doing things with it that you couldn't have done with just the paper catalog. So I mentioned the 4 metadata categories, so to speak, found in the paper catalog. I expand those to 135. And you might be wondering, why in the world did you do that? Well, I took literary qualities of the books, but I also expanded those to prosopographical ones. So trying to include a wider cast of characters, as you can see, for those of you on YouTube, we've got people like authors, translators, commenters, editors, publishers, booksellers, so on and so forth, as well as geographical data. So where are these books produced? But also, if they're censored works, what is the actual data? And the Russians began helping us out with that, and now using DH tools, we can expand our knowledge of that further. And of course, as you alluded to, we can start using linked data to enrich our understanding of this library. So the people, texts, and places associated with the creation of this collection, and ultimately with the creation of Voltaire's work. This is something I'm hoping to do in the future, and I'm glad that these resources exist because we can now do things we couldn't have done before. Now I'm going to show you 2 very quick examples of things that we can now see using a data-driven approach that we couldn't have seen before, and then I'll launch into a very quick case study. So something about the Russian catalog doesn't give us a genre. So I had to think about, how do you include this in the data set? And every choice we make with a data set is an intervention into the original artifact. So I had to be very careful to choose something with which Voltaire might have been familiar. So the classification I used was developed in the late 17th century in Paris. So it was likely one that he and his contemporaries understood. And what I did was I used the 3 major subject codes, so up to 3 for every book, because many of them cover more than one topic, and up to 6 subgenres. So now using that data, we can visualize the interdisciplinarity of the library. And it's a cool graph, great for cocktail parties, but it starts letting us ask, important questions like, the books are both on theology and law. What kinds of books are those? Are those shaping his view of church and state? So we can start drilling down into this data. And following the example of my co-presenters, I wanted to thank Mark Alge Hewitt and a number of other people at Stanford University who made these visuals possible. Now, the second example is finding the historical weight of the library. We are given what I'm going to call the stated date of publication by the Russians. So this is the date of the edition that Voltaire owns. Both classical authors, obviously they're published way before Voltaire's time. So if we only plot the stated dates of publication, the oldest books are around 1530, and then they go up to around Voltaire's year in which he passed away. And then we can, of course, map the genres to see from what periods he's reading. but I was interested to see how old, in fact, the library was. And what I'm showing you could not have been seen without a data-driven approach. So I went and I found the first date of every edition that Voltaire owns. And when you plot those dates, you see that the oldest books are around 500 BC. And there's a scarcity of books from the medieval period, which makes you think, why is he not reading books from this period? Is this typical of an 18th century library, as has been suggested? But now what we can importantly do is to contextualize his reading across genres. Where is his reading on law coming from, on theology? Now we can start doing really exciting things. I'm going to show you one of those exciting things in very condensed format. And it's using his Treatise on Tolerance, which is a short text. It's the one I recommend to anybody wanting to get into Voltaire. And he wrote it during what was known as the Calais affair, where a Protestant man was wrongfully accused and then subsequently executed for the death of his son in Catholic France. And Voltaire wrote the treatise as a condemnation of the court's decision, as a condemnation of intolerance. And if you look at the chapter, the table of contents, you'll see he has two chapters that are quite curious. The first, chapter 12, is called, Was Intolerance Part of Divine Law in Judaism? Was it always put into practice? And then the second chapter is called The Extreme Tolerance of the Jews. And it really raises the question, what did Voltaire know about Jewish history, Jewish faith, and Jewish law? When you say Voltaire and the Jews, it suddenly gets very awkward because he had a very fraught relationship with God's chosen people. So it only heightens the importance of understanding where these two chapters came from and what he knew about the Jews. So I went in and I used my genre classification, which has tabs for Jewish history and Old Testament / Jewish. And I pulled out those texts, there's about 32 of them, and I plotted the dates of publication, both stated and original. And what you'll see is that they're actually quite close to one another, but more importantly, they're centered around the early 18th century, late 17th century, which places them within the early Enlightenment, and that's a period of anti-clerical writing and debates about tolerance. So we can already contextualize Voltaire's knowledge of Judaism through this particular prism. And then if we look at the text he annotates, the most of the ones that really seem to have interested him, we can look at the authors, and those confirm our suspicion. These are some of the major figures on both sides of those debates. So he's reading across the aisle, so to speak. And then if we extend that prosopographical inquiry, we can look at the people to whom he's writing and the kinds of letters he's writing. And so my search on the letters was looking at words like Jew, Jewish, Hebrew. It's pretty narrow, but it's a good starting point. And we see that those letters peak around the time of the tolerance cases with which he was involved, which he was following pretty closely. And then if we take the correspondents who are receiving those letters, we can take their occupation, which is something I'm hoping to automate in the future, and we can map them. And what you start seeing just from this simple graph are people you would not expect to see. We've got lawyers, mathematicians, astronomers, magistrates, army officers, and noblemen. That is his occupation. That must be pretty sweet. And it makes you think, why did he choose these people as his interlocutors? And that is going to be my next point of inquiry. And then this is another way of looking at that same network grouped by the topics of the letters. So for those of you at home, Jewish history is being discussed by an army officer, an attorney, publisher, and a philosopher. Why these people? Can we uncover the choices Voltaire made in his social networks and in the milieus which constructed his work? Now, one of the major points that I forgot to mention is that we can't just look at the library. We also have to look at the letters, and we have to look at the marginalia, because his work and the development of his ideas took place across sources, and we need to enact convergence, if you will, to bring all of these sources together. So if we look at the letter topics, and you'll see he's interested in Moses, for example, the issue of mores, ancient astronomy, the golden calf, this one particular author, Warburton, and then you look at his marginalia, and I'm happy to talk in Q&A about how the marginalia is presented, and you look at the topics that interest him, you see the same topics appearing again, which is just a two-way street between his correspondence and his reading practices. And it really grounds the fact that this library is not isolated, it's not a hermit's library, it is a classical Enlightenment library where the philosopher is going out into the world and he's actively engaging with his world, and that's shaping his reading as well. And when you start pulling all of these threads together, books, marginalia, letters, you can start reconstructing the narrative that ends up in the Treatise on Tolerance. So he's interested in Moses, he's interested in leadership, in punishment, and in severity. And what you get is a narrative in which he says leaders like Moses and Joshua, they were capable of sowing intolerance and civil war, but they could have also developed people's mores, the ways in which they behaved towards one another, for the better. And of course, he's very interested in the issue of the golden calf, which really opens up this debate about what do leaders do when their people worship other gods. And I'm going to leave you with this really beautiful quote, that toleration never left the Civil War, intolerance has covered the earth with carnage. I speak here only of the interest of nations. And what I'm hoping this example showed you is that bringing together multimodal sources and working with them across different methodologies can show us a new way of reconstructing the development of ideas. Thank you.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to suggest you stay seated there. I'm going to move this to somewhere over here, and then we can. Get out of the way. Okay, so I want to just start with a few comments about some of the themes that I thought were coming out of that, and they're quite high level in general, but I thought were quite interesting. So there's one theme I think about this around making data, which I thought was quite interesting, which might be worth exploring in discussions, particularly sort of the decisions that go into creating the data sets we use in our research. There was a second piece about methods of analysis, which is quite a generic thing to say, but there felt to me that there was something emerging around the relationship between sort of the nice biz, as I think you put it, and reality, and that kind of old historical skill, I guess, of how we graph. And there's a third bit that's about machine readability and unreadability, an actually extent to which I think almost all of you are working with sources that are kind of, to a large extent, or topics that meant you had to delve into areas of machine unreadability in order to even start the process, which loops back to making data. I'm going to ask our speakers in a minute if they have questions for each other as a way of kind of, I'm sure you probably do, but I'll give them a break first. And ask those in the room questions, our speakers, either specific questions or ideally questions that sort of range across the topic.
Shall I kick off?
So you are.
Sorry, I'm Emma Goldsmith. I am no longer a working historian, but I'm interested in working historical. So we've seen network analysis so many times through these different presentations, and I was very interested in the extent to which people know networks already implicitly. So I come to this from experience in the business world where I work now, of people using networks, and often the analysis comes up with an answer that you might expect just from people's general knowledge of the subject. They know that things are connected, and they know who to influence, and they know how to get involved in the topic. I wonder if that speaks to anyone's project, or whether that people are knowing at the time how these networks are constituted, if we can in any way access their knowledge, or if we have to dissect them in this way, by creating data sets about them in order to understand what they might have known. To be honest, all
I don't want to take that one first. I guess the heart of that is like, did we get results we expected? And is that a problem?
I think I did in some ways, and it was partly just that I knew the network thing to prove it, I guess, to show it quickly. But I think it was just easier for me. I was in papers. It's like, here you go, rather than me telling them, you can see it. But there was some surprising elements from it in the wider network. But then you get so much, I got noise, I suppose, that it became relevant. That's why I showed you the two, because the first one I think was personal, but to a certain extent, yes, I think I did what I expected.
And I was saying with me because it wasn't, because I kind of have been trying to use network analysis purely to make my life a little bit easier, because you can try and do it all by hand, and it just becomes really messy. You never have a piece of paper big enough. And so for me, using the graphs, it was just an easier way of doing it, but also it enables you to kind of be able to constantly add stuff, take things away. And my hope is maybe in the future to be able to take this even further and make it more accessible, where other scholars can kind of engage with this data as well, and
create some kind of dialogue of what is going on, how are these things related, because in the context, all these artists were working kind of like, the major ones I've been looking at were kind of like brushing shoulders constantly. So there was always going to be some kind of link in my graph, but for me, yeah, it was just more of an easy tool, kind of selfish.
I'm not going to ask you all to respond to this question, but I guess it's interesting that if anyone wants to chip in, please do. But it's just that thing that's in about, well, is it a problem if we then find things we kind of expect to find? How is that then received within the extent to which we're trying to be innovative or expected, I guess, to be innovative in our research as researchers at any stage of their career? Where do we, if it's just something we expected, do we use that as a way of saying, well, I now really know this thing you all sort of suspected, right? And then we can launch on to something else.
It was Lea's, that's right, isn't it? Lea's question, presentation that really made me think of this. Because I wondered if these networks of people that you would understand who are working on different, these kind of images going out, do people recognize them at the time? Do they know? Is there a knowledge at the time that, oh yeah, well, if you could get buy a book from this publisher, then they always copy the images from this other thing. So there's like a level to which people at the time might have recognized this, and whether you can trace that at all.
Yeah, I was trying to come up with an answer because I was thinking that I'm not much surprised at the networks of people that I find, because they were quite aware of each other at the time, and I'm aware that they work together. But when I look at illustrations being reproduced and trace them, then that's a bit different maybe, because I mean for example, some of the illustrations are published in medical students' books, and then they reappear in children's books, for example. I mean, the authors are not really aware of that. So it's something that is interesting for me, definitely, to see where these illustrations travel. But then is that a network? I'm not sure if you would call that a network of illustrations reappearing. But that is something I find interesting. And then what people were aware of is that I think someone said that microscopy publications are compilations, really, all of them, because it was very common to copy illustrations. So it wasn't known at the time, but I don't think that people expected to find illustrations by opening a certain book. Sorry about that.
Further questions?
Yes, I am from the UCL and I have questions about your methodology in plotting these networks, right? Which programs or application or website do you use to plot these networks?
Yeah, well, I'm using Gephi.
Gephi actually was what I used for this genre.
Yeah.
But I used a lot of them.
G-E-P-H-I, yeah.
Gephi.
Yeah, it's a free one to use. I was told to go to that one because it was the easiest one to begin with. But yeah, I think there were others. Yeah.
There's also Polaudio, which is what I use, and you just throw in your data. But there's also a question actually that was raised in a different seminar. When you throw your things into this black box, what kinds of assumptions are you making? What kind of assumptions are the computer making? You know, how do you interrogate those, and how do those shape your research as well? And I'm wondering if you've run into that, because in that way we can compare what we expected with what we got. And sometimes that's the value of getting what you expected, because you see that the computer and you are on the same wavelength. Sorry, that took me the question to a different place, but I guess another side of your question is, how did we learn about these tools? How did we learn to use them? A lot of them are intuitive, but in your case, there was a bit of a learning curve, and I think there is for everybody, and sometimes it's a 90-degree angle.
I mean, without being on the spot, what I was really interested when he was speaking of Aleks was that you came at this very much from a kind of sociological perspective, where there are standard methods of thinking about the relationship between networks that are probably more embedded in the methodology of that discipline than they are in history. And indeed, things like Gephi, the kind of the algorithmic approaches underpinning them, in theory at least, are based on those sociological methods, right? But you seem to be more interested, I guess, in the methods without the kind of the viz then being fully made, shall we say. I thought that was really interesting because, you know, other people sometimes speak about social networks, almost never show the graph and just show the numbers. But actually you were starting really deep down with the theory behind those numbers, which I thought was quite interesting. I wonder where, I guess is that just down to your background, I guess, or was that a really conscious decision? You thought that was an important starting point for talking about relationships and people?
So it's partly to do with my background, but also like Lena was saying, I also came across this question of like, you just have this black box and it pops out a nice visualization for you, and you're not really sure how it comes up with that and why it groups certain nodes together and not others. So what I wanted to do is get an understanding a bit more about what constitutes a social network and how the connections between different people work, and that's why I decided to go the kind of sociological path first. And I do really actually want to learn about the kind of algorithms that go behind producing these visualizations as well. It's just I haven't done this part yet, but it's
I just wonder, just curiosity, that if we compare two graphs, one drawn by hand and the other one done by a computer, which is the other from the same data? Just complete curiosity. What you said, we started using it because we never find paper.
Yeah.
Data.
Well, yeah, I mean, how I could show you bits of my bag, like how I'm trying to join it. Yeah. Yeah, you run out of colours. You don't have enough colours. It's just like a name.
You cannot
Oh,
cut it.
and then you just yeah. So from that degree, I guess yes, for me anyway, they would look the same. But what's unique about networking is there's so much more you can do. So you can, what other people have been saying, map the temporal timeline of it. So with certain applications, you'll be able to highlight a particular time zone within that cluster, and it will be able to show you there and then, rather than you having to like go through, okay, where's my drawing of 1280 to 1290? Oh, it's right there. So it allows you to get a lot more intricate in that kind of sense. I mean, that's what I think anyway. I don't know. I've had opinions. No, you all agree. It's fine.
But I think that's an important part of why, I think go back to questions I was interested in making things as well. What is the kind of the cost benefit, right? I mean, I started down this path myself with this problem, which I was drawing maps and when I can't turn things on and off. As the ability to quickly turn things on and off becomes, it stops you getting wedded to that thing you spent ages creating, I guess, and gives you that ability to kind of quickly move between different views. It might make us move between too many views too quickly, possibly. It gives us that view. I mean, and even go back to the Gephi question, one of the interesting things about Gephi is that most of the algorithms in there don't produce the same graph every time.
No, they don't.
They produce the same maths,
Yes.
but they don't produce the same picture. And that's actually a really interesting, as long as we were aware of that, that's a really interesting way of thinking about, well, it isn't that different to drawing it by hand. It's some kind of mathematical, visual interpretation of mathematics. So there's it's the play bit, right? If we're not going to get too wedded to everything we switch on and off and kind of then create, I guess the problem comes down to being too wedded to the viz, and it goes back to the question about how we have the skills to interpret the visualization.
And we also can't assume the visualization is the end all be all of our inquiry, because we always have to say, well, it's just one way of looking at the issue.
Also, I think if you're working with numbers and stuff like that, I think it would change from what you draw by hand, just because the way these programs are able to visualize it as well, but also it's quite different when you're working with quantitative numbers.
Can I ask the speakers if any of you have a question for somebody else?
I have one for Jack.
Do you?
Yeah. Quick line. No, it was actually just more like, if you were to go back in time, what would you do differently? Because this is stuff that people else might be struggling with.
I think I would just forget the data stuff for a while. It doesn't mean I don't think it was useful, but I just so wedded to having a certain outcome, and it's like you said, it's just another tool that we're using. It's not the be all and end all, but in my instance. And I think as well, I spent so long like with that vague charge that it was just. I think I got to a point where I thought I'm imposing myself on the sources,
Yeah.
and I'm not just recording what's there.
Yeah.
And then the database became problematic. And I think I would record less information. It doesn't matter that there was red stockings stolen or whatever it was.
Yeah.
You know, I would be much more straightforward in what I did, and would probably save myself a lot.
So are you still using all the data in your, or like, all the
Yeah, I
networks?
use it a lot.
Yeah.
But it's more, you know, so now because I categorize everything. Oh, and that's the other thing. For me, I would just have one set of rigid rules as to how you record stuff and stick to it.
Yes.
I kept changing my mind and I had to go back
Right.
and do everything. So the categorizations, I simplified them a lot. And so what I do now is my chapters kind of work along different systems of wealth extraction, and because I restructured the database to reflect that, I can just say quickly, you know, I want every single charge or allegation against a purveyor, or whatever it is, and I can bring that up quickly, and I can sort by the value of the events. So it is really useful.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I would do if I had my time again.
So does that then become an appendix?
Yeah, I don't know.
How does that work within the handing in of the PhD? Is it like a URL link? Or?
Yeah, that would be. I think that would be the ideal, and it would just be then linked to the CSV file.
Yeah, and then let people.
Yeah, or it could be an appendix, but it would be fairly hefty, potentially.
What I find really interesting about your answer is that I'm so interested in the fact that all of you were making stuff, or in your case, setting up other people to make stuff. Because I'll come back to in a sec. And that there's an inherent tension there, because I see a lot of papers where people start by saying, well, this is how I think this thing was created that I'm using. Move on, it's data, use it. And something you said there, Jack, was about that you're imposing yourself on a data set. Well, in UK copyright law, if you create a data set, there's copyright in that, right? And it's assumed under copyright law that there is agency in making data sets. But what's happening is that you're learning about the data you're making while you're making it, which means you keep making it and knowing it's faulty. And that's what's really interesting. And it feels as much about you're kind of kicking yourself a bit too much, and should just be like, just document the hell out of what you've done.
Yeah.
So other people know if they come to use it or you forget about it, how actually it came to be, and they know about some of the problems with it. I think it's probably similar with your work. I get the sense you knew a lot already about Voltaire before it started, right? You had a sense of kind of what Voltaireism could be, and then we're starting to go from this knowledge, create a data set, rather than just being a person going, how do I create a data set like Voltaire's library? But then now you're doing something different. You're getting other people to do it. And you're creating the parameters by which other people are then filling that in, and maybe are pushing back to you and saying, can we do this differently? You're like, it's got to be rigid.
Multiple things, but yeah. Also, I mean, I also feel like I'm imposing myself on data all the time. For example, what makes it more difficult is that I'm also collaborating with a data scientist. I met him online. He offered to help me because I set up the project and went fine, but then I got some of the data. I didn't really know how to work with that because it wasn't what I expected. It was extract. I had to do something with the data and I couldn't do. So I asked for help online in Zuniverse forum, and then someone came out and said, yeah, I could do that, I can help you. He's a retired data scientist, but he has a very quantitative approach also, and that's also difficult sometimes because he wants me to make the data more machine readable, which is new to me. And for example, I had to define what is an illustration. There are tables, there are things scribbled in pages, and there are, for example, these whole plates, including several illustrations. Is that one illustration, or is that single illustration in the plate one illustration? This was so difficult for me. I think he didn't quite understand why this was so difficult. He just wanted a simple answer that the illustration is enough. So yeah, that was difficult. I think we found ways of dealing with that. But yeah, also in the forum, people have different ideas about how to approach the project. Although I think most of them have been really helpful and had good suggestions, and it was quite rewarding working with them. Really. But yeah, I'm kind of creating my own little network also, which is nice. By analyzing other networks. I enjoy that, but it's also challenging.
So I think we have time for one more question before we then go off somewhere else to talk about our work. Do I have a question?
Did you try to use image analysis software, image recognition software?
No, and that as soon as you were talking, I was thinking, oh, I wonder if she's used that.
No, I haven't. I haven't at all. I tried to do that. It didn't work.
No, I haven't. No, I think that at this time in my life, that would just be a bit too much. Maybe in the future, but I can imagine that being quite useful actually. But then, does that mean the machines are taking over my role of being able to see who's working?
That's a short question, so do I have any other final questions?
I was going to ask, a lot of you touched on the idea of inconsistency, the works you're dealing with, and how you then put that into your data set. That's often very time consuming. The idea that sort of convergence to produce the data set itself pulls a lot of you into it. I just wondered how many of you actually produced a research strategy to do that, so you could achieve that capability, or did you just, as you're going along, figure it out, which is
No research strategy. That's because my work isn't centered around.
I mean, yeah, I definitely learned as I went along.
Yeah.
One thing that was really useful there was like, our Honeysett produced this thing about editing medieval documents in the 60s using that corridor roles, and I found that was actually really useful because they don't necessarily techniques are that different. Maybe doing different stuff with the data, whereas in the past it was maybe index files. But that was really interesting about how you approach these. You know, because I'm sure it's true across all periods, but particularly in the medieval period, you don't even have standardized spelling by the same clerk. You know, great. A name, his own name down differently 3 times in a row. So I don't know, but anyway, it's infuriating. But yeah, that I definitely learned as I went along. And I think it would be interesting if there was more training. I mean, I know they do stuff at the OHR on the historical databases, which I think go to. And the programming historian is very good.
I mean, Lea, I mean, you're working with library data on books, and librarians are famously A, really precise, but also B, have really precise methods of dealing with uncertainty. And you know, they have established long-standing methods of doing that. And were you going with them and sort of taking on board their methods of uncertainty about place or about dates, or were you just sort of ignoring them and sticking the middle date when you're doing your graphs?
I think it would have been helpful to have been a librarian going into this project. I am taking on board what the Russian said about uncertainty with place. But the thing about working with data is now we can confirm things that would have been uncertain to them working back in the 60s. On the other hand, you don't want to obscure things that you think are uncertain because it some way diminishes your work, but you want to say, yes, we're uncertain about this and it's going to be a part of the data now. But when it comes to research strategy, one of the things I found very helpful in curating the data set is the kind of data you include. This gets at your thing about including too much information. What kind of questions do you want to ask? And you let that dictate the kind of data you include and the way in which you structure it as well. Just returning very quickly to the issue of uncertainty, I'm trying to develop a system for marking a book as possibly being published in the wrong spot, or like having the wrong information associated with it, and finding a way to have an ontology of uncertainty so that you can, apply it across the data set. We're still working with it. And Russians are notoriously good with bibliography, so yeah.
And given I think the historians spend most of their time dealing with uncertainty, that seems like an appropriate point to end. So thank you all, and that was great, and I hope you've got some out of your audience for some wonderful questions as well.
We're off air.